Hello, my name is Sicco Stortelder. I'm working as head of Agroforestry Hub for Acorn. Acorn is a program, agroforestry program from the Rabobank. Thank you all for joining this presentation. The topic of the presentation is designing agroforestry systems for carbon. My title of the presentation is Seeing the Agroforest for the Carbon, and I will surely dive into that topic to understand what I mean with that. Briefly, an overview of the content that I will discuss in this presentation. We're first going to focus on agroforestry approach, how we see agroforestry within Acorn, but also from a personal perspective. Biomass in trees, of course, a crucial element for dealing with this topic. Looking at carbon revenues from agroforestry and carbon sequestration, and how they also relate to the wider carbon revenues, the wider revenue stream of agroforestry designs, and some concluding remarks. So very briefly, first of all, Acorn. Acorn is a large agroforestry program for smallholders where we assist smallholders in transitioning from monocultures to agroforestry systems. We have set up a certification system whereby we certify large-scale agroforestry programs in the global south, where with a new technology with remote sensing satellites, we are able to monitor biomass increases on all small plots scattered across the landscapes. One of the nice things of this program is that we focus purely on smallholders, and also that smallholders receive a very fair revenue share from the carbon, which in our case means that 80% of all the carbon credits that are being sold via the Rabobank, 80% of the revenue goes to the smallholders. And this is, I think, quite unique, and also in relation to the focus on smallholders and the assistance we provide with that makes it a very nice program, which is very nice to work for. Now, looking at our approach towards agroforestry. So we see it as an holistic approach where we look at agroforestry in a larger setting of benefits that can be generated both for the farmers and for the landscape. Because if I would focus purely on the economic part and saying, okay, let's do agroforestry for carbon revenues, let's grow trees that are very fast growing, have a high wood density, can capture a lot of carbon. Of course, that's possible, but it's also kind of a limited view on what agroforestry is meant for. Agroforestry, the whole concept itself is that you transform to a system which incorporates a lot of factors, not just a single goal such as carbon, but many multiple goals. And here I've included quite many of them. We have, of course, in the economic sphere, carbon, but also other revenue streams from, of course, fruits, from nuts, from crops. Sometimes also to product certification, you can fetch higher prices. You have the element of farm productivity, which is very crucial as well. How can you ensure that your yields and that your production, not just in the short term, but also in the long term, is very beneficial in your system? And how can you use trees and plants, water hedges, shrubs to ensure that these yields are high, are stable, and contribute to healthy crops? There's a social element to agroforestry, which, of course, in our projects is also very important, which relates to health, which relates to gender roles, which relates to food security. Farm boundaries, I think, is also very important because often exactly the farm boundary can be used as well as a way to integrate trees in the landscape. The component of soil and water, of course, with integrating trees on your farm, you can increase soil and water quality in many aspects. And last but not least, the environmental part, of which carbon is, of course, also part of, but of course also looking at the biodiversity. We are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis in the world. You need to look at air quality, you look at reducing soil erosion, you also look at optimizing in a way your yields in a farm, make it very productive, so you also don't need to use much more land. One of the reasons why deforestation occurs in the land is because we are not very efficient with land use, and also for that reason agroforestry is interesting to implement. Now, agroforestry, what can it contribute to carbon sequestration? So therefore, I first want to look at the tree itself and where the carbon is actually stored in. So we have basically two areas, two carbon pools, so to say, to which the tree is contributing with carbon. That's the above ground biomass and the below ground biomass. The above ground biomass consists of the leaves, trunks, and the branches, and the below ground biomass consists of the roots. Of course, apart from this living biomass, you have also dead wood, litter, humus layers. You have also carbon in the soil. But in this case, I'm focusing for this slide on carbon captures in trees. And what you also see in the bar chart is that this relation towards how much biomass is in the stem, in the branches, and the leaves is also changing over time according to the age of the trees. That's something also important to take into account. If you look at how much carbon is actually stored in, for example, 100 trees after 20 years. 100 trees is quite a regular and normal amount of trees when you, for example, talk about cocoa or coffee agroforestry systems. You can actually see there is a big difference between what type of tree you plant, what species. Here you see that cocoa captures around 30 to 40 tons of carbon after 20 years for 100 trees. Citrus trees often are a bit smaller, have also a different form of the shape of the trees. Cashew can be growing quite tall, has a bigger absorption rate, but in particular native forest trees, in this case we plotted Carapa guianensis, a fast-growing tree from Latin America. Those can really grow tall, grow a lot in terms of diameters as well, have big root systems, and these kind of trees are the ones that can really capture a lot of carbon in the field and also act at the same time as with other benefits such as providing shade for crops. So not all trees are the same. There are a big difference between what kind of trees you plant and how much carbon they can capture. Now I'm getting to my point and why I called this presentation Seeing the Ecoforce for the Carbon, because additional carbon income can be really significant, especially if you are a smallholder farmer with limited revenues from your crop yields. And of course, in a program like Acorn, where a farmer receives 80% of the credits in revenue, this can be significant. But still, the amount of money that a farmer can make, even with high prices, such as 30 euros per ton, which we often sell carbon for in Acorn, the total amount of money a farmer can make with the carbon is relatively limited compared to what he can make from the sale of the yields of his crops, which could be coffee, cacao, citrus trees, citrus products, nuts, like cashew or macadamia. So that's very important to take into account, that and where we also want to understand that when you support a farmer with planting trees, it is very important to look at that his yield from his cash crops, yield from all the annual crops that he possibly has, is not affected by the additional planting of trees. It should be going parallel in that sense. Over here we have the orange bar, for example, is indicating how much additional revenue we can get from carbon revenues. And that is, as you can see, a smaller proportion from the total bar. Now we get to the designs. Many people ask, what's a good design? What tree species do I need to plant? Well, I think there's some general rule. There is no perfect blueprint agroforestry design, but there are very good questions to ask to get to a good design. And I'm summing up here some of the questions that I think are relevant to ask when you want to develop an agroforestry design. First of all, you have to look what is your baseline of your agroforestry plot. Is that, for example, pasture land? Is that an existing cocoa plantation? Is that does it already have a lot of shade in the system, for example? How is the soil fertility looking like? Is it a very degraded land? Does it have good humus layers? Is it depleted in a way? And of course, you need to look at, is there any access from the farmer, by the farmer currently for seedlings or not? Then also crucial is, what is the farmer interest? Does he have an interest in subsistence crops? Is it a relatively poor farmer that needs to increase food and nutrition for his family and for himself? Is he a very commercial focused farmer that needs, usual way is, for example, producing a lot of coffee from his farm, and that needs to be increased or that should be maintained? Or is it, okay, I already have quite a good system in my producing a lot of coffee in my farm, and I just want to add another revenue stream, for example, from carbon. There could, of course, also be many other factors. I'm just naming a few. What could be the interest of a farmer here? Another important element to take into account, what is the size of the plot? If you have a relatively small plot, for example, half a hectare, 3/4 of a hectare, maybe 1 hectare, and you are depending on that as a living, as a smallholder farmer, you really want to make sure that you optimize the conditions for the cash crops and also the cash crop trees if they are part of the farm, for example, a cashew tree or a cocoa tree. Because it doesn't make too much sense to say, oh, I have, for example, 900 cocoa plants in my farm. That is where my main production and my income comes from. I'm gonna remove many trees of those, and I'm gonna plant carbon trees instead. It must be a balance there, because the carbon in general is not worth that much yet to compensate for in terms of income from the cash crop that he has. If you have a bit of a larger plot, but even a plot like a hectare, you can often do very much with your boundaries and your because they are on the side of the farm. They are often already a fencing line with neighboring farms or other areas. You can use them as living fences. You can use them as windbreaks. You can use them as fire breaks. And of course, having them as a tree line also has a social function of showing the land tenure that, or the land use that the farmer has, keeping animals out, for example. So the boundary is often a crucial element which you can benefit for planting trees. Then the environment. Of course, you need to select trees and crops that fit the environment and the farmer and the market needs. There are, of course, many elements in terms of environmental factors. To name a few, the climate and the temperatures, the level of rainfalls, the soil conditions, the altitude, but also looking ahead in the future. Will there be a very big expected climate change in terms of large drought periods? Will the climate, the temperatures be way higher, or is that relatively stable? Will there be a lot less or more rain? Of course, sometimes very difficult to get hard data on, and climate modulations come with a lot of uncertainties, but it is good to look at it and take into account for your trees, because once planted, you expect them to be there for decades. Markets, that's a crucial element, of course, as well. Do you want to focus on a single cash crop, or is the farmer or your project interested in developing other crop value chains? Now looking at some design options, and I'm going to just give a very simple overview of a couple of ideas, but I think it's also important to take into account because it determines a lot on which crops you can grow and how much shade your trees going to provide, whether certain trees or crops are competing for space or for nutrients or for light conditions, which of course determine a lot on how they will grow and how productive they will be. So the first one, as I already mentioned, the boundary planting, I consider as very important, in particular for those projects that produce crops that require a lot of light. For example, think of maize, think of sugarcane, think of grains. These are crops that need a lot of sunlight, need to do a lot of production based on photosynthesis, and therefore you don't want to have too many trees within your farmland, and you better plant around the farm. Another nice hint there is to plant trees in the west-east direction if you don't want to bring too much shade into your system, because the sun, of course, goes from east to west all over the earth, and thereby the shade of the trees are, if you put them in the same line, they will provide shade to each other rather than on the farmland itself. Alley cropping is, of course, a very famous system within agroforestry, where you can intermix both trees or hedges together with annual crops. And of course, we have fruit, nut, tree, orchards. You can make a lot of layouts there. And often you have, very important is, of course, the spacing of the trees. Take that into account and see what kind of trees you can include in the system, and look very well as well at what kind of strata these trees will be occupying. If you have a tree such as, well, I see a hazelnut here, they may be 5 to 10 meters tall, for example. If you have a tree which you plant which has the same height, and of course there will be a competition in the strata, which is not so favorable for your system. So think that through before planting. Another example, and I think this is also good to remember, is that, and here I take the example of cocoa agroforestry, that the shade requirements of a certain crop, they can differ over time. And cocoa is a nice example of that. For example, a cocoa plant in the first 2 years requires a lot of shade. The leaves are relatively fragile, and shade is really a necessity for them growing well. The recommendation is to have about 60 to 70% of shade. How do you do that? Well, think of planting banana before a year earlier, so they are tall, maybe 6 months earlier, so they are a bit tall, provide shade, and the cocoa can develop well in the first years. Once you get into later stages, you really want to have less shade in your system, which you can do with pioneer species, and then you can think ahead after 10 years to have more secondary climax trees in your systems, which are relatively tall and provide shade at high canopies. So this is, I think, crucial to always think through, how will my tree look like at certain moments in the time over the coming decades. And also, when it comes to carbon markets, there is an increasing focus on the durability, the permanence of carbon in your system. So you also want to plant trees that store a lot of carbon for a long time. But you can also, if there is a system where you also want to use timber, for example, from your farm, there are also some systems where this is possible, and you have special methodologies where you can account for the harvesting of timber trees in your project. But it's also important then to take into account that these timber trees, on the one hand, they will have a negative impact, of course, on the carbon levels of a certain project. It will lower the total carbon revenues in your system. Timber trees may also affect and damage cash crops when you're going to harvest them. Imagine a thick 40 centimeter thick tree that you cut in a coffee plantation. There will be many coffee crops damaged if you just let it fall anyway. But it's also important to take these things into consideration from the very first moment on, and when designing and planting a project, because they will have its repercussions over 10 or 20 years when you, for example, cut down a tree in an agroforestry project. Overall, I think my main message is take advantage of all upsides of agroforestry. And of course, I haven't dived into that much, but I'll give you a bit some things that I think are key when it comes to benefits of agroforestry. For example, the leaf litter of the trees, of the bushes that can fertilize the soil, can also help for mulching of your crops. Of course, generating these humus layers of the tree branches and the leaves enhances the soil health and the soil life. like the worms, like the beetles, all kind of fungi that are present and have a network in the soil that could really support the health of the trees and the crops in your soil, in your farm. Of course, carbon sequestration, I've talked about that. Look at pollination advantages. Many farms in the global south, they lack productivity also because pollination is not optimal. And of course, if you can be a host for bees and for other insects that pollinate, that can really help to contribute yields of your fruit or nut trees. Soil erosion, of course, you can reach a lot of soil erosion reduction with planting the right trees. Also study the trees that you plant, which one are really good and have certain root networks that limit the effects of soil erosion. Of course, a cooler microclimate is important. That can be both important for crops and then the lower strata cash crops, but it can also be very important for the farmers and the people themselves that work in the farm. We have increasing temperatures all over the planet, and this topic is increasingly important as well, just to have a cool climate conditions to work in. Of course, it comes with the benefit of diversified and stable yields. It is proven that with agroforestry practices, with improving this better quality soil, that over time you need way less fertilizer, artificial fertilizer, to keep crop productivity stable. So an agroforestry system may not be the solution for reducing artificial fertilizers in the first couple of years, but it will be significant effects when you are getting into later years and when really your soil after quite some years has really recovered. And one of the messages that, of course, I bring is that don't be blindfolded by the carbon in that sense in the agroforestry system. Let carbon be a part of a holistic approach where you look at all the many benefits that the agroforestry system brings for the farmers, for flora and fauna, for the soil life. From my perspective, this should be a nice add-on, a nice cherry on top in many systems that can contribute to additional revenue streams and can contribute to the mitigation of climate effects. But for me, the main message is the yields of farmers are often the most important element, and ensuring that the yields are high, and that they are stable, and that they are coming from preferably natural cycles of biomass being decomposed from trees into the soil, etc., is very important. That was my presentation for today. Final slide to mention that we have a newsletter from Acorn you can subscribe on our website. We also have a YouTube channel recently set up where we also share webinars that we organize as Agroforestry Hub about, of course, agroforestry topics. Feel free to subscribe and watch those. And with that, come to the main topic of if there are any questions. And of course, thank you for your attention.